Hi, my name is Christina Galbaugh, and I'm graduating from Piedmont University with my master's degree in middle grades mathematics. In addition to that, I'm getting my gifted endorsement through this program. My theme for this capstone presentation is No Ability Left Behind. The quote to back up my theme is by George Evans, and he said, "Every student can learn, just not on the same day or in the same way." Some information about myself is that I graduated from the University of North Georgia with my bachelor's degree in middle grades math. And since then, I've been teaching for 4 years at Gainesville Middle School. I've been teaching 8th grade math all 4 years. And the past 2 years, I've taught Algebra 1 to the advanced 8th graders who are in the accelerated program at that school. When I'm not teaching, I am a wife and have a 5-month-old daughter, and I enjoy photography and camping. Before I continue with my presentation, I do feel the need to express how important it is that I'm completing my master's program over the summer because I'm accepting a new job at Commerce Middle School next year. So Gainesville is the only place I've taught at. So here are the demographics. As you can see, they're going to change drastically. So I definitely will be using a lot of the techniques from what I learned on my master's within my teaching at Commerce Middle School. So Gainesville has almost 1,800 students for 6th through 8th grade, whereas Commerce has a good 510 students, but they also include 5th grade at their school. So at Gainesville, I was one of 6 to 7 math teachers. However, at Commerce, because the school system is so small, I will be the only 8th grade math teacher there. So I will get every ability level, which essentially is where my theme comes from for no ability left behind. And you can also see the big change in the ethnic backgrounds. Gainesville had more Hispanic percentage versus Commerce, where the highest percentage is white, with Hispanic and African American following behind. At Gainesville, they had African Americans were 16%, so they were a little bit higher, and then white was the minority at Gainesville. So through my pedagogy, I spoke about 5 beliefs, and I'm going to briefly discuss them here. My first one is just being flexible as a teacher. For example, this past year, I've had to adapt to new teaching strategies. And in a sense, I bring up that I had to use a lot more technology than I'm used to doing, especially as a math teacher. I would prefer paper and pencil. My second belief is that differentiation is so important in the classroom because all of our students are unique. Therefore, they do need a unique education. And I will be portraying that at Commerce, given that I have all the ability levels. My third belief is the mentoring aspect of teaching. Teaching is not limited to just your academic content. In the pedagogy, you'll see that I shared how I become vulnerable to my students and share some personal things about my experience as a student in hopes that they can trust me and know that I know what they're going through, especially in middle school. And then my fourth belief kind of ties into differentiation, but it's about learning strategies. And I learned that differentiating through process is more important than the answer, which the answer would be a product. But for math, for example, when I give homework assignments, I have learned to give my students the answer, which is kind of crazy, but I do that because I would rather them show all their work to get the right answer. And then they can also see if they don't get the correct answer, they need to go back and check themselves anyway. So it kind of helps them through their process by showing their work and checking to see that they get the correct answer. And my final belief is, again, about giftedness and no ability left behind, which is what my research paper is about that I'm about to get into. All students do have the potential for giftedness, though. I've learned that even in my first couple years of teaching, I did not have the higher achieving students. I was given on-level students and some lower level students. And I saw so much potential in these students. So for my research paper, I decided to focus on finding instructional strategies to challenge gifted students. And with that, I did write my research paper towards the end of the fall semester of 2020. And so with COVID going on, I decided to look into technology and something that was virtual friendly. So my research paper, I narrowed it down to an online math program that I actually was currently using at Gainesville Middle School for my students. And I call it ALEKS. Right here, ALEKS, that's kind of what me and my teacher colleagues called it, was ALEKS, but it stands for Assessment and Learning and Knowledge Spaces. And we use that throughout the year. So firstly, one of the reasons why I chose my research topic is because last summer of 2020, I learned from Rim, Siegel, and Davis a lot of things I didn't know as a teacher. I learned that the No Child Left Behind Act actually pressured students to focus on struggling learners. So our lower level students, and it actually ended up leaving the gifted students left behind in the classroom because the teachers had that assumption that those students could figure it out on their own, which is actually a myth. There might be some gifted students that can kind of pick up on things on their own, but they still need that communication with the teacher. And there was a lack of that once teachers were pressured to help the other students. Secondly, I learned through Gentry that who she did a study about some more negative effects of the No Child Left Behind Act and how it affected classroom learning. And this caused teachers to focus on essentially teaching to the test. As you can see here, a mom or grandmother is asking this child what they learned in school today. And well, basically, she learned how to be a good test taker for standardized testing. So they really focused on that. And it took away a lot of the meaning from education. Students were just learning how to answer test questions properly, etc. And again, the gifted students were left behind because of that assumption that they were good test takers. And finally, I chose the research topic, and I chose using ALEKS specifically for my research. Based on some more things that I learned from Park and Oliver. I learned that gifted students do learn at a faster pace. Again, they are meant to be challenged at their ability level. And when they're kind of learning below their ability level, they are learning at a faster pace just because it's not challenging. They can pick up more quickly. But I do believe that when they're challenged, they're not getting so far ahead of the rest of the class because they are going to have to take time to process information. And so I did discover throughout my research, and I'll explain later, that ALEKS does challenge the gifted students to where they are able to here benefit from a self-paced instructional strategy. And I learned through, I believe it's pronounced Yoon, that he believed in differentiated instruction and extension activities for gifted learners. And again, that is essentially what Alex, the math program, did for my gifted students. First, like you should do for any unit or grade level to see where your students are, Alex gives a pre-assessment, which in the program it's called a knowledge check. You can give several of these, but typically you give one at the beginning of the unit, and then you would maybe give one at the end. You'd have your pre and post assessment. Not unit, excuse me, I meant the school year. Anyway, so I gave it to my students, and what the knowledge check does is identify the student's individual strengths and weaknesses. You could look at the class as a whole, but for this specific research topic, I looked at my gifted students individually and looked at their growth. And then what the knowledge check does was it documents their mastered topics or mastered standards. And so once they do this, the program actually creates a personalized pathway for them. And in the program, it was called Continue Your Path. And what this did was it was a self-paced learning strategy for students, and it delivered instruction based on their readiness. And what this did as well, it eliminated careless busy work. I've been guilty before my master's program, not really knowing what to do with students that finish early. I would just give them some extra work to do, which was work of things they already mastered. They were just doing more work, and I knew, and they expressed to me that they hated that. And I learned that in my gifted program as well, not to give them busy work. And then Alex is just an interactive way to learn because it does provide explanations for the students. So I would give Alex as an extension activity after they finish their work. What Alex did was take them back to the place they left off. And oftentimes I discovered Alex would move them ahead a few units. I had a student start to learn something, and we were talking about it. I was like, well, we have not learned this unit yet, which is why you are feeling challenged here. And I told him, I said, I want you to go through the explanations of that Alex provided, and he ended up teaching himself. So here's a screenshot from the program from a student, and I want to explain everything to you here that you can see, and how there's so much more, but this is the best one to show you. So I explained in my research paper about the pie chart that it provides. So first of all, the knowledge check, which was the pre-assessment, shows that this student mastered 225 topics. Now, if I remember correctly, there's about a little over 500 topics. So this student was already about halfway there with what he learned. Now you can see through the arithmetic readiness that he mastered 65 out of 65 topics completely through his knowledge check and never had to go back and redo this stuff. That's why I love the program too. It does not make them go back and do things that they've proved mastery on. Now, here's an example of real numbers for this student. They mastered 60%, which that 60 was added to this, excuse me, here, this 225. And here, the darker yellow is what the student learned from his, or mastered from his knowledge check. And then through his continued pathway, this lighter color is what he ended up learning. So these are all the new things he learned sort of without me, but through the program. So in general, from this screenshot, he mastered 225 topics in the pre-assessment. And then since then, he had learned 40 more topics. And then the program calculated 35 more topics that he was ready to learn based on the prerequisites that he mastered. So excuse me. So I want to quickly show you the demographics of the gifted 8th grade program. It's really crazy, but out of the 1,800 students in the school, there was about 585 8th grade students. And out of those 585 8th grade students, there were only 46 gifted identified students. And I know this because I was on the gifted team. So I was the teacher that had all the gifted students. These were just the students that were tested and confirmed gifted. Out of that, there were 29 males, 17 females. And then I wanted to kind of touch on the ethnic background of these students, because typically, in this community, 65% Hispanic. So within the program of those 46 students, there were 23 Hispanic students, which was half of that population. And then whites were 24%, African Americans were 9%, and Asian was 17%. Through my research, I found that academically gifted students were the most successful, and they showed the most growth and earned more topics that they learned without me, just at their own pace. This ALEX program works best as an extension activity. I would not use it for regular instruction, just because it's kind of like an individual learning experience. And during class instruction, I want to do more peer tutoring assignments and group work with collaboration. But I did like how the students were able to take ownership of their learning experience, and they were motivated to learn topics ahead of time before I taught them, because they did feel good about it once they learned. And then lastly, I did learn from this research experience that the students that spent more time at ALEX showed the most growth, which kind of makes sense because they had more time to practice. Again, practice does make perfect. In addition to my research, my course reflections really play off of that. As a math teacher, I took the Fostering Algebraic Thinking class, and I learned how to help students think differently about math. One method that I really liked and plan to use in the future, is doing undoing method. So they might, I talk about how instead of learning how to solve an equation to get the answer, they could take the answer and go backwards to create an equation, which is a higher order thinking skill for gifted students. And then with these last three that I'm going to talk about here are all my gifted classes. So I learned special characteristics of gifted students. I learned that Hispanics or other lower socioeconomic groups like Hispanics and Asians and even African Americans are not typically identified for gifted services based on stereotypes. And again, at Gainesville, I did have many special characteristics of gifted students. And then through my second course, I learned how to incorporate creativity into content lessons correctly. Creativity does not mean you can be an artist and draw. There's a lot more in depth about that. For example, just allowing students to literally create their own math word problems. They can pick their own topic or their own hobbies and make that connection in math. So I learned how to do that effectively. And then in my last course, I've learned how to differentiate correctly, and not just for gifted students, but differentiate to make sure your lower level and on level students are receiving the correct education as well. So before my master's program, I really lacked in some of these areas, but after the master's program, in my personal growth essay, I talk about how my classroom management for gifted students has improved, because now I know how to differentiate and challenge them to their best ability level and not give them just like busy work. because giving them busy work will cause them to be behavior issues. I've learned through technology, which actually using Alex to engage students with extension activities. And I also used technology, for example, Google Classroom, to organize all of my lessons daily, given that COVID required a lot of students to be out. So I used technology to keep my students ahead. And then I've been very flexible this year. And have used creativity within my lessons to allow students to collaborate. And then I've learned about assessment bias awareness, especially given that at Gainesville, I was at a school with mostly Hispanics and African Americans, and how to make sure you're not giving them assignments that could be biased or kind of hurt their self-esteem based on stereotypes. In the future, I want to get more involved in my community. I'm going to be teaching at Commerce now at Gainesville for the first 4 years of teaching. I kind of laid low. I was still learning a lot. After this master's program, I do feel more confident in a lot of things, which is why I also want to take on more leadership positions at my school. For example, doing professional development classes, known as PD. And lastly, I just want to thank all my Piedmont professors. They've taught me so much, and they were all just so kind throughout this whole experience, and very understanding and knowledgeable. And thank you to Dr. Beverly Addison and Dr. Michael Harris, if you're watching, because you're evaluating me, and then to my teaching colleagues and my family, because I could not have done it without the support of them, given that I have a 5-month-old daughter. So I've been doing the program since the first 2 semesters I was pregnant, and then now these last 2 semesters raising a newborn and completing my master's program. But I'm very happy in everything I accomplished, and I thank you all.